The Cold War was a period of tension and conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. This tension impacted all facets of life for the citizens of these countries, and its results define the global culture as we know it today. The Cold War lasted from 1947 until 1991. The United States wanted to contain the spread of communism, an ideology which was only loosely practiced by the Soviet Union, but one which threatened to overturn the capitalist global order. They created the North Atlantic Treaty Organization to form a united front against this ideology and practiced a system which they called containment, where the goal was to prevent any further spread of this ideology. The Soviet Union believed that capitalism, the economic theory rooted in greed and exploitation, would lead to the destruction of the middle class and would create unlivable conditions for those in poverty. Their proletariat movement had unfortunately been derailed by Joseph Stalin and his lust for global power. Though they had nationalized many industries, they were still working under a social hierarchy which left many people living under poor conditions. According to Karl Marx, communism is a system in which the control over the economy is in the hands of the workers rather than in the owners of the companies. It is a system in which there is zero private property, in which power is held by the people rather than in the hands of a select few. Capitalism is an economic model in which finite resources are distributed through means of competition. Innovation is then rewarded through financial gain. While this system does create enough wealth to sustain a national economy, that wealth is spread so unevenly that nearly 40 million people lived below the poverty line last year in the most affluent country in the world, despite record profits for its most successful citizens. While the Soviet Union did brand itself as communist and did take steps to nationalize certain industries and ensure better rights for the working class, it still existed in a system under which power was unevenly distributed, and this greed for power is what led Stalin to be in control. His measures in office were for the sake of expanding his own power rather than for helping out his citizens, and therefore it was not communistic in the truest sense, in that it still had one national leader, an authoritarian one at that. While the US and the Soviet Union never had a war against each other on their own lands, they fought in what they called proxy wars, where each would endorse one side of a conflict. The two most notorious examples of this were both in Asia, which were the Korean War and the Vietnamese War. In 1950, the Soviet Union financially and militaristically supported Kim Il-sung's invasion of the Republic of Korea. The United Nations courted the United States military in order to defend the South and prevent further spread of communistic ideology. The United Nations attempt was spearheaded by United States General Douglas MacArthur. In 1945, Ho Chi Minh formed a political movement in southern Vietnam in order to gain independence from both French colonists and Japanese invaders. The North was led by Emperor Bao Dai, who was supported by the French colonial government. The sides were divided between capitalism in the North and communism in the South. The United States eventually attempted, but failed, to lead the North to victory, and withdrew troops after Richard Nixon signed the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. This is still considered to be America's largest military failure, and the grotesque number of civilian casualties has haunted this nation since. In the fall of 1962, the Soviet Union made a deal with Fidel Castro that they could install nuclear missiles along the northern coast of Cuba in exchange for economic and militaristic aid. For 13 days, the American people lived in constant fear that they may be vaporized by a foreign power. Fortunately, Nikita Khrushchev agreed to disarm under the conditions that the United States would not invade Cuba and would instead respect the sovereignty of a communist government. In the late 1950s, both governments decided to shift their focus on space exploration in order to create a display of dominance in factors militaristic, economic, and technological. Though the Soviets were successfully able to send the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, the Americans were the first to safely land a man on the moon in the Apollo 11 mission in 1969. Though the Cold War was recognized to have formally ended when the Soviet Union crumbled in 1991, modern-day Russia and its conflicts with NATO show that these tensions may not have necessarily eased. Meanwhile, the United States has doubled down on capitalism, and the middle class is all but extinct. The world now stands on the brink of war because this conflict was left unresolved. I believe it would not be inaccurate to state that the Cold War never truly ended.